Hey everybody, welcome to Leon's Chainsaw Parts and Repair. We're going to do yet another video on the Walbro HDC carburetors. Super 2, XL, XL2, 350, 360, Super Easy, 150 automatic. That might get close to covering the Homelight models that it was in, certainly the families. So pretty widely used. And I've got a lot of videos up, but in my, was it my easy check valve test? I think it might have been that video. I referenced a crankcase pulse interrupting the flow of fuel. And I recently was reminded why I don't go on to Arboristsites forum all that terribly often. Someone had asked a question about a carb, and I think it was for a 360, and I put the link to that video there of, hey, if you haven't tested your check valve yet, here you go. And naturally, somebody came back with some less than favorable comments about the video, which it is what it is. I don't care. That's part of why I avoid some of those forums these days, just because of the people, honestly. But one point that he made, I had to stop and think, wait a minute. Alright, I hadn't considered that. So again, when I make these videos, I'm not trying to come across as an expert. I'm trying to convey what I think I've learned. And I may have conveyed something inaccurately. And that has to do with what the actual function of the check valve is, what it's primarily doing. I think we can all agree that it's preventing air from mixing with fuel and interrupting the flow of fuel. This user on Arboristsite said that it's preventing air from mixing with the idle fuel charge. Okay. And I couldn't quite wrap my mind around how that would be happening. Dryer's done, by the way. As if you guys care. What are the odds, right? So anyway, we're going to get to that carb. I was able to find a service manual on Walbro's website, actually, that details what's happening at each stage of throttle, and mix that with looking at a stripped down carcass. We're going to run through this a little bit, and I think I understand what the gentleman was saying. And we'll do this one from in the office so that we can switch over to the computer and look at a carb, and yeah, we'll run through this. Okay, we're going to start looking at the service manual here. So this obviously covers the entire HDC series of carburetors, which means there's going to be stuff down in here that we, and by we I mean us Homelight nuts, don't see a whole lot of. Like 15, which is a governor or accelerator screw plug. There's a governor here that might have seen on some string trimmers, stuff like that. But realistically, when they do one of these manuals, it's going to cover every HDC carburetor that was produced. So what we're focusing on primarily is the question of what number 12, the seat assembly check valve, does. And that is the valve, the screen, the seat, the whole thing. So we're going to go to page 2. See if I can do this smoothly. And I can't. That's helpful. Alright, well, we'll do it that way. So, they've got a number of different drawings in this manual that detail different points of the carburetor, like starting, idle, like full, throttle, all that. We're looking at the starting circuit right here, but that'll be useful enough to kind of orient ourselves to what's going on here. So one of the first things you want to take a peek at and kind of wrap your mind around is these screws are drawn where they don't belong. Obviously, they are not on either side of the carburetor where the throat, they're not parallel with the carburetor throat. This just had to be drawn this way in order to understand, or in order to fit everything on the screen. So it makes it a little tougher to understand, but you just gotta look at it, look at the carb, and go, yeah, okay, that makes sense. So for starters, what I think we'll do is just kind of run through this. So here's your fuel inlet barb, and again, this is showing a straight barb. A lot of the carbs we deal with don't have a straight barb, but some do. Some have an angled. It doesn't really matter. Reality is when you're looking at the carburetor, it's going to be this hole right here, and this is a parts carb that I've stripped down. So you got your fuel inlet. Fuel is coming in. Number 2, surge chamber dampens fuel flow. Okay, alright, so really all that is just an elbow. Number 3, inlet valve opens on demand from pump. So let's look at our gaskets and diaphragm here. So that would be number 3, the inlet valve that opens on demand from the pump. Pretty straightforward. Then fuel is going to flow, and there's another valve, number 5. Outlet check valve forced open by pump pressure. Well, that's way over here. Okay. Alright, that's cool. So you look at that and it starts to kind of make sense why all of these different chambers, you know, there's a cover that goes over this, we all know that, but why these different chambers exist. When you look at the diagram, that's why. So looking at the diagram, the last place the fuel goes on this side is through the screen. So that's going to be right there. And on the other side of that, of course, is the fuel metering needle, or fuel inlet needle. What are we calling it on here? Inlet valve, inlet needle valve. Lifts off seat to allow fuel entry. No matter what you call it, there you go. That's what it is. So that's red, fuel, on this side of the carburetor. This is the inlet side of the carburetor. What's this yellow? Crankcase impulse air. Okay. Now, honestly, I've questioned this before, and a lot of us have. You know, what's really operating everything? Is it an impulse pressure, or is it vacuum? Well, we've got an answer here as far as I'm concerned. Engine impulse actuates fuel pump diaphragm number 4. Okay. So you've got pressure on that side from the engine. So when you come back to your carb, essentially what you're looking at is that big area right there. That is your actual fuel pump. So pretty cool. You know, it's not nothing magic here. That is what does it. The complicated part is this other side of the carburetor, and that we're going to call the metering side of the carburetor. So that's where your check valve is. I'm going to flip this over. So right here again, this is a stripped down carb. We're down to the area that's underneath the circuit plate. And I want to familiarize us with some basics before getting too far along. Your high speed side is on the right. Your low speed side or idle circuit, again, you can use interchangeably, is on the left side as you guys are looking at it. Sure, I'm right there. Yeah, good. Or I should say, make sure I'm correct there. Alright, here's our check valve. So our high-speed nozzle, main nozzle. And here are the various ports for the idle circuit. 1, 2, 3, and there's actually one there, number 4. So this is the circuit. Now we have our circuit plate gaskets that help direct fuel. Then we have a circuit plate. And of course there would be a needle in there and a spring and all that sort of jazz. I just want to get you guys familiar with what we're looking at so that when we go back to the screen here, we can start kind of wrapping our minds around it. So this is the starting circuit. Okay, here's the choke. We're showing the choke plate fully closed. Makes sense, cold start. Throttle is about half open. If it had a throttle latch, actually that's 2/3 open, whatever, doesn't matter. If you guys drop start a Super 2, I'm thinking of a Super 2, it's probably going to be wide open. That's how I start mine. If it's a Super Easy with the throttle latch, you know, that's probably close. But let's pay attention to what it's telling us. On the starting circuit, remember, red is fuel. Blue is air. So there's air on the air filter side of the choke plate. So that's out over here. There's air on the top side of the metering diaphragm. That's the big main diaphragm, the one with the nub that we have to check ever so carefully. And everything else is a fuel circuit. And when you look at this, it's like, oh my goodness, what in the world? But remember those holes that I pointed to in the carburetor base down here, down in there? That's this right here, these, okay? And that's showing fuel coming through those. So let's take some 9, 10, and 11. Third hole increases fuel flow at part throttle. That's way up here. So as the throttle plate is closed, it's going to cover all but one of these holes. And as you open it, they become more visible. And the farther open the throttle is, the more fuel is going to flow out of this. Until finally, the main circuit's going to take over and provide the primary charge of fuel. So number 10 is this middle one. Second idle hole allows additional fuel flow on acceleration. Okay, so that's important. That's basically preventing a bog when you transition from idle to part throttle. So number 11, primary idle hole, only fuel source to engine at the idle position. Throttle plate fully closed or at least set back against your idle speed screw. So that's it. Okay, so what's this reservoir, number 23? Idle fuel port, fuel reservoir for idle and part throttle nozzles. Okay, so how is that being fed? Well, you're like, God, that dead ends. Well, it doesn't. Okay, the way this had to be drawn, this should be connected. All right. In reality, it doesn't look 100% like that, but if you could imagine that this was a different shade of red and it connects down to here, because you've got to meter it with your number 19 idle needle, adjust for fuel richness to 3 idle holes. Those right there. So low speed circuit, it's labeled L on the carb. That's what it is. Okay. Alright, so, fuel has to be traveling this way, gets past the needle, gets up into here, and that chamber, as it's drawn, is this chamber right down here. And your gasket is going to seal that up and provide a single path in for fuel, which, if you follow these ridges through here, it's going to be coming out of the idle area and travel around and in like that. I don't want that one. I want the Z-shaped one. And that's why this circuit plate gasket can matter an awful lot. We'll talk about that in a minute too. But that, once fuel has come up out of here and is in this open area, it gets down underneath the circuit plate, and then the gasket and those ridges, whatever cutouts are here and the ridges underneath, are what channel the fuel. So for that idle circuit, low speed circuit, whatever you want to call it, your needle has controlled how much fuel is getting from this point to here, and then it draws it into the engine through there. Fairly straightforward. That's not, looking at it on here on the computer screen, it looks kind of goofy. That's fairly straightforward. So yeah. Alright, and so you come back and you're like, oh, well, that's showing the path of fuel interrupted by 12, the high speed needle. Adjust for fuel richness at high speeds. So we'll talk about this a little bit more. There's two drawings that we can look at, if I remember right, on the next page. I don't want to get into it too much, but certain versions of these carbs are fed by one fuel source. Okay, you know how some circuit plates have one hole, some have two, and that determines which gasket you should be using? That's why. Some of these are fed by one source, some are fed by two. It's that simple. So on the high-speed side, we're seeing, okay, there's a big load of fuel there because we're starting and we've got the throttle either locked or pulled open. Okay. 22, nozzle check valve. Oh, okay. Engine vacuum draws valve open. Okay, that's real simple. Pulls it off of its seat. Pulls it open. There's a set of ridges down here so that it's not actually sealing that. I don't have this one out, but there's ridges like this so that there's still a passage underneath it so fuel can get around it. Okay, so that's open. Alright. Fuel where it's flowing. Okay, alright. Here we go. So this is off of that main diaphragm chamber. Fuel hole right down here on the plate. Gets under, gets into the circuit. Your high speed needle adjusts how much fuel can flow through there. Boom. Fairly straightforward. Fairly straightforward. So if we back it up even further, the only other piece to this puzzle that's of real importance on this page is, alright, this is connected. Again, the way this is drawn, you know, they had to draw it in a way that it would fit into a 2D space. But obviously the fuel passage doesn't cross the damn carburetor throat, but you've got to imagine that this is connected. These 2 points right here. Screen, passage, needle right there. So that's how you've got to think of this, is that would be a connected line there. So we've gotten the fuel from the tank, through the fuel pump, through the screen, it's at the needle. Again, they're not showing the crankcase air pulse opening this, but that's what it has to do. Can you guys believe it? I almost did it again. You got to challenge yourself sometimes to unlearn what you think you know. I have always thought of that metering diaphragm as being actuated by engine pulse. This drawing clearly shows that it is not. And yet, I opened my mouth and blah, there it was. The way this is drawn, the way this is shown, the way that has to work is the pump generates enough pressure to push that needle off of its seat, overcome the spring. Okay? And then pops back into place. Once the pump, that, I guess it would be a pulse from the pump, pushes fuel up. And the engine has to turn, has to create that pulse, actuate the pump, push the needle off the seat, fuel comes through. There's clearly no engine pulse on that side of the carburetor. There's no way for it to even reach there when you look at the way things are drilled and the way those castings are made. So, again, that's a simple concept, but it's not one on this carburetor that I grasped until editing the video and realizing I had almost put another, we will say, uninformed statement in. That's what starts all of this, is fuel is now available to be drawn into the engine. I think I've beat this particular diagram to death enough. Let's go to the next one. And hold on a second, I want to make sure. Idle speed circuit. So we've got everything The same up here. Okay, we're showing the idle speed screw, which would be actuating the throttle lever on the arm to open and close this plate. So there's some real important stuff right here. So they were showing this basically closed. That primary idle hole is the only one that is visible on the engine side. So that's where it's going to be drawing. Idle port, again, is our opening in the carburetor down here. Now what is it showing? It's showing a mix of blue and red. So it's mixing air and fuel. And the only way that it can be doing that, to the best of my knowledge, is to be pulling it in through one of these others that's not open. Even though it's showing red there, again, like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm not claiming to be an expert on this stuff. I'm trying to understand it as I go. If you've got your choke open at idle and air is filling the carb throat and this throttle plate is closed and it's actually mixing in the idle port there, I don't know how in the world it's not mixing with air that's being drawn in from one of these. Somebody has a better explanation, please let us know. So air, fuel, coming out of that primary idle hole right there, boom, okay. Everything here is still operating the exact same way. Throttle plate closed, just idle. Okay, we go down to the second one. Everything up on top looks the same. Our throttle valve has now moved part throttle circuit. Okay, so this is going to be, this will be like an accelerator point maybe. You know, you're accelerating, maybe you're just doing a quick cut on a limb. Part throttle, didn't need to go full bore. All three of these idle ports are now exposed. They're drawing fuel and it's showing a mix of air in there, all of it. Okay, cool. So you're basically maxing out this low speed circuit. At this point it's flowing probably as much fuel as it can. Okay, again, choke is wide open, plenty of air can move through here. Not a whole lot else to say. Let's go down to the high speed circuit. And this is where it gets a little different. Not a lot. But the important part is, look at this drawing. So we're at full throttle, choke's fully open, and now we have fuel flowing from all three of these. So the idle circuit, low speed circuit, whatever you want to call it, right here, is still flowing fuel. But your primary source is this high speed circuit, which means the check valve is open and it's flowing fuel. And you've got a maximum amount of air coming in. So there you go. That's how the fuel is actually moving through there. So what does this check valve actually do? Why does it need to be closed when you're in these particular instances right here? Because that's what it's showing, is that it's closed right here. Even though that drawing isn't as clear as it could be, by showing air here and not fuel, that essentially means it's closed. Why? My explanation on the previous video and my belief at the time, and I still believe this to at least be partially true, would be to prevent any sort of interruption in the flow of fuel because of any sort of engine pulse that gets past the reed valve. Now, the explanation that the gentleman on Arboristsite gave was no. It's to prevent air from being drawn into the idle circuit through the check valve, or through this wider main nozzle. which is a really interesting thing. I had never considered that. But with what they're drawing here, showing air there, now that could just be their way of showing that, hey, it's closed, we're not flowing anything, so you've got atmosphere here. Or it could be exactly what this guy's talking about. As again, it's not something I'd ever considered. So realistically, what he's saying is, without that check valve in place, you're gonna, through engine vacuum on these low speed sides, these low speed settings, the instances, I should say. Without this check valve, instead of drawing fuel through here and through the circuit, you're going to actually introduce air because it's going to want to draw air in there. And that's very, very possible. That would explain, when there's a blown check valve, you can usually get it to run at high speed, but at low speed it dies out, starves for fuel. Maybe that is the path of least resistance, and the fuel pump cannot overcome that. Possibility I had not considered, so he could well be right. Just another reason why you need an active, functioning check valve. So, hard to say. Now, this page, we looked at the high-speed circuit, but this has some really good information here. Dependent. What is that? This schematic shows the low-speed circuit getting its fuel from the high-speed circuit. We mentioned that earlier. So again, the way this is drawn, fuel comes in to the carburetor chamber here. So fuel has come in past the needle. It's floating around up here. Floating around up top. It gets into the circuit. Okay. This dependent versus independent is talking about how many holes. That is a dependent. That opening is right above the high-speed screw. Okay, so this is a dependent, a one-hole dependent throttle plate, circuit plate. So that means all of the fuel is drawn through this high-speed opening, or the high-speed needle controls how much fuel can flow to the engine. And that's really, really interesting. So think about when you have one of those single screw carburetors where there's only a low speed adjustment. That opening is controlling that. Or when you do have the needle, where you set that needle controls how much fuel can be supplied to the engine, because that's the choke point. How much fuel it lets past and into this circuit, whether it's going out through the main nozzle or filtering its way through the low-speed circuit. That screw is going to tell the tale. That's it. Wherever that's set is it. And that's why these can be very interrelated. So that's an important detail. This independent circuit, again, in some HDC carburetors, the high-speed and low-speed circuits both take fuel directly from the metering chamber. Right there. That one has a hole drilled above the low, and one drilled above the high. And again, that uses the non-Z-shaped gasket. Get that out of there. So I know the 360s are like this. I think the 350s are too. And that may be a function of just how much fuel a 58cc engine needs versus a 31cc or a 25cc like an XL. Think about that. Same carb body. Obviously different high and low needles, different circuit plate. This is a huge hole. This is big. I'm guessing this one probably came from a 360. So in this scenario, okay, let's keep track of where we're at. This is the high speed. So you've got your nice big high speed opening. You can neck that down with your high speed needle. Boom. Now all of a sudden the idle circuit has its complete again, the small hole here, that's a completely separate fuel entrance. So then the low-speed needle independently will control how much can flow out of this idle circuit or low-speed circuit, whatever you want to call it. Obviously, I would say this is preferable, independent, because it gives you the maximum amount of control and it'll be the easiest to adjust. For this dependent circuit, you might set this a little too lean at first, or, you know, and that's the most likely scenario. Set it a little too lean, you get your idle all dialed in, and you go to rev it, and oh crap, it just doesn't quite, yeah, it's not quite right. And then you got to back this off again, which may make this too rich. So you've got to do minute little adjustments to get it right. But that's really just an important detail to keep in mind, and that's part of why these circuit plate gaskets matter so much. So the rest of this is basically just a very minor service procedure. You know, it talks about for flooded carburetors, diaphragm set too, lever set too high, dirt under the needle valve, circuit plate and gasket leaking, metering lever spring not seated on dimple and metering level, fuel pump diaphragm leaking. And this is all the kind of stuff, excuse me, that we talk about and do on our carburetors all the time. Lean carburetors, dirt, and main idle channels. Okay, these old carbs don't have a bunch of hidden passages that are hard to get to. That's it. That's your passage to the engine, okay? You can run a little chunk of wire through there. Odds are really good that's not what's happening here, because that would have to get past your screen way over here. So that would be an odd scenario. That would be very strange. Metering lever set too low. Okay. That's possible. It's not something that you see very often in here, but the reality is as long as it's sitting up off the plate about 1/8 of an inch, it's probably not set too low. Hole and metering diaphragm, that's your big main diaphragm over here. I'm sure that would do it. Pulse line from crankcase to carburetor plugged. Well, in this case, you don't have to worry about that on the home lights because you have a gasket. So, short of the gasket covering that hole, I mean, that might be something worth checking. Make sure you got the right gasket on there. Leaky manifold gaskets, yep, that would reduce your impulse. Leaky nozzle check valve. Well, that sounds familiar. For lean carburetors. So again, that points to the gentleman on Arboristsite having some real knowledge about this. So, and again, that's what it feels like when you rev one up. It's got a bad check valve. It'll lean out as you come back down to idle. So that may very well be the answer right there. Fuel pump diaphragm check valves worn. Well, that's just these. If those have gotten stiff or a buildup of crap on them and they won't seat. Dirty fuel inlet screen, we've covered that. That's the screen right there, just clean it. Easy enough. Faulty fuel delivery system to carburetor. That means a bad fuel hose. That's all that is. Alright, in the manual here, needle settings. Power and idle needles control lubrication received by the engine. Adjustments should be done carefully, blah, bitty, blah, bitty, blah. Set power, high-speed needle, 1 turn open, and the idle, low-speed needle, 1 turn open. This puts both slightly on the rich side, and leaner adjustments can be made as needed. Too lean adjustment can cause improper lubrication. Now, I will say I prefer to go to 1.25, just because most of what we're working on is older. It's worn a bit. 1 is, on some engines it'll be alright, but that's probably going to be a little bit on the lean side, at least in my experience. You may have something different. Maintenance instructions. Talks about pulling it apart. We've seen that easily enough. Adjusting the metering level, super simple. Straight edge across the body, right there. Metering lever should just touch the straight edge. Slight pressure will bend the needle valve up or needle valve end up or down. Yeah, be careful. If you bend this very much, it snaps. A lot of you guys have found that out the hard way. We've all done it. I've done it. You don't get a huge number of radical adjustments out of this. So, yeah, I think we have covered just about everything in here. I'm going to post the link. Again, this is on Walbro's website. I'm going to post the link to this in the video. And this could be useful to reference as you guys are troubleshooting. Okay, that was a lot of computer screen, watching a mouse drag around, little dental pick pointing at a gutted out carburetor. But it's very plausible. Very, very plausible, because when you look at that gutted out carburetor and how the check valve is right there, right into that metering circuit, that could be very much what it is. So, I like having better knowledge. I like having, I like having the right information to put out. I'm not going to ever intentionally put the wrong information out. So, yeah, there we go. I think this might be a better, I think that's a better explanation for what the check valve is doing. So, lean condition. If you got one in an HDC or an SDC, there's a lot of Walbros that use that style. I think even the HDB might have that setup that was used on the 610s and some of those McCullochs. So, yeah, it's very important. That check valve is very, very important. I think we can all agree on that. So, hopefully this video will stand the test of time a little better than the other one did. Like to think so. If not, great. We're going to keep on learning, because that is what this hobby is about. Best of my knowledge, damn few of us were engineers for any of these OEMs, so we're learning as we go. I hope this helps. I hope the running through the drawings help kind of get everybody's mind wrapped around what the carb is actually doing. And actually, when you take the carb apart, it's less complicated looking at it than it is looking at those drawings. Like I say, trying to get those flat, you know, in a 2D presence or presentation that will actually work on paper is very difficult. I think they did a really good job, but I think the carb is more intuitive to actually look at on your bench and go, okay, that's how it works. So we'll add this to the file of HDC stuff and catch you guys in the next one.